Good morning, guys. I hope you are having a good Thursday morning. It's a bit tricky for me to do these intros because always record them the day prior, so I have to remember what day I'm on. Now, today what we're going to be doing is kind of a mixture between screencast lectures like what I'm doing right now and some textbook work. The reason I'm kind of splitting the difference here is because originally I had planned for today to be something that you did entirely out of your textbook because I know you get sick of listening to me and I get sick of recording these. But the problem is your textbook does a really terrible job about talking about early colonialism, especially in Latin America. And that's not good for us because eventually we're going to have to come back to the Americas to talk about revolutions in Unit 9. And if you don't have a good, strong background on society in Latin America now, then you're going to have a real hard time with revolutions when we get to Unit 9. So I want to make sure that we cover this appropriately, and I'm going to do it as quickly as I can. So here we go. So, what I'm going to cover in this discussion online through this lecture is just going to be about Spanish and Portuguese colonization in Latin America. You're going to do some Northern European colonization work out of your textbook in just a bit. But so here we go. So, as we discussed, a little bit over the past couple of days, the first major area that was involved in colonization in the Americas was the Iberian Peninsula, right here. That's the Iberian Peninsula. Obviously, this brown area is Spain, this blue is Portugal. Now, what occurred was that you had these early explorers like Vasco da Gama and Bartolomé Dias coming out of Portugal, which, take a look at where it's located, that makes sense. And they were trying to get here. They were trying to get over here. And they were trying to get there because of trade routes and particular spices and all sorts of cool stuff. And so the Portuguese decided to kind of dot their way down the African coast. And as they went, they set up little trading ports. That's what these little blue dots are. And eventually they went around the Cape of Good Hope, up this direction to the Swahili coast, and then from thence over to India. So the Portuguese kind of wrapped up the Indian Ocean trade routes by going around the Cape of Good Hope. And that's what drove the Spanish to go this direction. This is what prompted like Columbus and all of them to be like, hey, what if we go this way in order to get here? And And the rest, as you know, is pretty much history. You wind up with the Spaniards making claims here in the Caribbean first, and then moving into the Gulf, and then moving down and up from there. South and north from there, rather. The Portuguese also, because of their connections over here in Africa, if you actually catch an ocean gyre that goes far enough, you will wind up in Brazil. And so the Portuguese landed in Brazil pretty quickly after the Spanish did. And this was a problem because they both claimed all of the Americas in favor of themselves. And so, being that both of these countries right here were Catholic, they appealed to the Pope in Rome and they were like, hey, Pope, who gets the Americas? And the Pope was like, well, both of you. And the Pope basically drew a line. That's a terrible line, but we're just going to roll with it. It's really more like here. There we go. And that was called the line of demarcation. And basically it meant that everything this way from the line went to Portugal. And everything this way from the line went to Spain. All quote unquote uninhabited lands. And that's why the Spanish, therefore, wind up with like these territories over here in the Pacific. Because the Spanish were like, yeah, basically that line goes to here-ish, maybe. And so they claim the Philippines. But this is why the Spanish have so much territory in the Americas initially, and why Brazil becomes the only territory that is claimed by the Portuguese. This is called the Treaty of Tordesillas, and it kind of dominates the way that the Spanish and the Portuguese deal with their claims in the Americas for much of the early portion of the 1600s. So here we go. So the basic thing, because the Americas are therefore largely initially colonized by the Spanish, I'm going to lean heavy into the Spanish issue here. So all colonies, regardless of whether or not they were colonized by Spain or Portugal or the British or the Dutch or the French, whatever, all colonies in the Americas were initially designed to enrich the mother country. That is what colonialism was about. It was about exploitation of wealth. And the idea was to have these colonies where you could extract wealth and then make the mother country better off as a result. This is part of an economic theory called mercantilism. Mercantilism basically says that the economic benefit of one country must come at the expense of another. So therefore, for a country to be powerful and strong, it needs to accumulate as much wealth as possible. So mercantilism kind of drove the economic and political decisions of these European powers. Essentially, money from the colonies were used to increase the military might of the mother countries. So Spain, initially in the 1500s and early 1600s, was the superpower of the world because it was massively wealthy. It was massively wealthy because of the plantation agriculture that was being carried out in many of its colonies, especially in the Caribbean, like Cuba and what would eventually be known as Puerto Rico and Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic. Those were all places of great wealth for Spain. So, like I said, you had sugar production in Cuba and Santo Domingo and other Caribbean colonies. They used chattel slavery in order to gain this wealth. It is a wealth that is soaked in blood. They also used their colonies for raw materials, such as precious metals, like silver and gold, but especially silver. The Spanish claimed territory in what is today Peru, and in that territory, there were veins of silver running through the Andes Mountains. The largest vein of silver in the world at that time, and frankly, even still today, they're still mining this mountain, was found at a place called Potosi. Potosi was an incredibly valuable mine, and the Spaniards figured out how to extract silver ore out of, or rather extract the silver out of the ore by washing it with mercury solution. This was a deadly process, but it made the Spanish massively wealthy. Ships carrying silver came all the way across the Atlantic and all the way across the Pacific, and they flooded the market with this American silver. Now, that is actually going to be a big problem later on. We'll get into the economics of it later. Now, the Spanish also decided to lean heavily into the use of mita labor, like the Incan system of labor taxes. But now the process isn't reciprocal. Like, the native populations aren't getting anything back by providing their labor. They're just being forced to do it. So like I said, the silver coming out of Potosi radically altered the economic system of the entire world. When you have too much of a metal or a currency on the market, it makes the value of that metal or currency lower. This is called inflation, and the Spanish didn't really understand it, partially because in 1492 they had basically expelled the entirety of their banking system by forcing out Jewish and Muslim populations out of Spain. And those people had largely been involved in banking because they had been prohibited from being able to own land or run shops. And so as a result, banking was the only industry they were allowed in. And in 1492, they were all expelled from the country, which meant that you had no one who really understood economics in charge of the financial system in Spain. So Spain made some pretty poor choices. Now, in terms of the organization of the colonies, in Spain, there was a notion that the colonies were so critical to the Spanish crown and to the well-being of Spain itself that they had to be directly overseen all the time. This means that all Spanish colonies were overseen directly by the crown. No Spanish colony in Latin America had a great deal of independence, even though they were separated by the Atlantic Ocean from the mother country. They were led by something called the Council of Indies, and it laid out total policy about how everything would work in Latin America. And they also used the Catholic Church as sort of an organizing principle within the colonized areas of Latin America. So if you ever travel to Latin America, You'll notice a couple of things if you go to recently, rather, to colonial area locations. Here, let me do this in white so you can see. I'm going to have to erase this in a moment. But okay, if you go to a Spanish colonial town in Latin America, chances are at the center of the town, you will find a plaza. Okay, P-L-A. It's hard to do this with a mouse and keyboard. Sorry. So there's your plaza, okay? Plaza is a big central open space in most cities and everything. And this was often like the center of like social and commerce, like social action and commerce. And on one side of the plaza, you will inevitably find a church. Inevitably. And on the other side, you will find a government building. This is not just happenstance. This is because all colonial Spanish towns were built the same in terms of their basic layout and structure. This was so that you could send in military from like the mother country, from the Iberian Peninsula, who had no idea what Cuba was like, what Santo Domingo was like, what Puerto Rico was like. And you could send them to Havana. You could send them to, San Juan. And it wouldn't matter. They would know the layout of the town immediately because everything was done exactly the same. This is central planning. The church also was one of the very first things that was always constructed in every single Spanish colonial holding. And that is because the church had within it the ability to essentially act as its own little government. And so it became very, very useful. So almost immediately following the arrival of conquistadores into Spanish territories or newly claimed Spanish territories, Spain almost immediately sent in the Jesuits. Now, remember the Jesuits from our discussion of like the later portion of the Protestant Reformation? The Jesuits were sort of the Catholics' response to the Protestants. They were a group of very highly educated priests who took a vow of poverty, and so they were used to hard living. They didn't mind living in difficult conditions. And they also actually invented the field of linguistics because they realized that in order to convert native populations, you had to first understand what people were saying and that sort of stuff. Now, so the Jesuits went on missionary activity to try and convert native populations. They also, because they had taken this vow of poverty, were sort of suitable for early colonizing efforts because things were hard or different, and they were kind of used to that. Now, initially, under the Jesuits, conversion was usually quite voluntary, although highly pressured, like, we will give you these things or treat you better if you convert, but it wasn't forced. It wasn't until later that that changes. So during the early Jesuit period, in the early 1500s to almost the 1600s, there was sort of this notion that the only way you could get native populations to convert to Catholicism was that if you made an attempt to understand the belief systems of the native people. So the Jesuits weren't actually bothered by this process of syncretism, which is the blending of native beliefs with other beliefs. So if you're familiar with Catholicism in, say, Mexico, you'll note that Catholicism in Mexico is markedly different from what goes on at the Vatican. I mean, like, if you have seen Coco, like, Dia de los Muertos is not a thing in a lot of other places. That's a remnant of indigenous religious beliefs and emphasis on the role of, like, death and, like, and sacrifice in terms of the connection to religious beliefs. So that happened pretty much all throughout the 16th century, this blending of indigenous and like beliefs in Catholicism. But by the late 1500s, attitudes started to harden. Also, there were different religious sects of Catholicism that had moved into the Americas by this point. And especially under a number of different groups, and I won't get into the specifics of them, priests started forcibly converting native populations. Native populations were forbidden from practicing any of their traditional indigenous faiths, and those were actively suppressed. And this is where we have the burning of, say, like the Mayan codices. Now, you can see kind of the syncretism in terms of religious practice in, say, Mexico with this image right here. if you're familiar, you might know this. This is La Virgen de Guadalupe. She's the Virgin of Guadalupe. She is the patron saint of Mexico. And according to tradition, she appeared, she's a manifestation of, or an avatar essentially, of the Virgin Mary. And she appeared to an indigenous man. And it was miraculous. And she's often depicted, it's a bit difficult to see here, as mestiza, meaning that she is of mixed ancestry, which I will get to in just a moment.